So, last time we were talking about how in the olden days, people tended to legitimize and justify why they were in power by claiming divinity or claiming that they were appointed by a divinity. Now, as a Christian, I'd argue that in a minority of the cases, leaders were appointed by a divinity, by God. Now, before you tell me, hang on a minute, what sort of nonsense, let's put that to one side and let's just go back in time to a historical account, a biblical account you may have heard of before. That again takes us back to the purest form of politics as I see it, which is governance of the people, leading the nation so that everybody within the nation thrives. Come with me. Now, I want to take you back to the story of a character you might know of, a biblical character called Joseph. You know, Joseph and the multicolored raincoat? Well, through a play of circumstances that we're not going to get into, Joseph finds himself in Egypt, first a prisoner, then catapulted to the position of the second person in command of Egypt, second person after Pharaoh, because he was privy to what was going to happen to the nation, namely 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. Now, what does Joseph do? He comes up with a plan. 7 years of plenty means that there are 7 years of surplus that have to be stored. So he manages to get that sorted, get the country to store the grain ahead of the 7 years of famine, which means that when the famine hits, the people are not starving to death. Now, at one point, the famine is so severe, I mean, it's 7 years, it's a long time, that the people actually start to run out of money to buy food. Therefore, Joseph comes up with a plan, and the plan is that those inhabitants of the nation can basically indenture themselves, become employees of the state, of a nation, or however you want it. The accounts say that it was slaves, but yeah, in a way they were. They sold themselves to the government in exchange for grain. So they didn't starve again. So why do I say that was the purest form of governance? It's because everybody in the nation was catered for. The allocation and reallocation and management of resources resulted in the nation surviving, and not what we see nowadays, which is the poor gets poorer, the richer get richer, and people starve and people are destitute.
Well, you would be perfectly in your right to tell me, yeah, that's nice, but you're cherry picking. What about those times where those supposedly appointed leaders waged war, decimated other populations? What of that, Christian boy? Good question. There's something you need to know about wars waged in Israel and by the people of Israel. You'd be surprised to know that when Israel waged war, First of all, you wouldn't have children soldiers. You had to be at least 20 years of age and not fearful. If you were fearful, you could opt out. That's one. Second of all, there was no scorched earth strategy, which is to basically, when you go against a nation, just ravage the whole landscape so that they can't feed off the land while they're waging war, so that they starve and obviously get weakened. That was forbidden. They were not allowed to touch nature. Nature has nothing to do with the war, therefore should be left intact. Respect for the environment. That's two. Now three, very often the war was avoidable if the nation that was being attacked surrendered. And in fact, even when they did not surrender, it wasn't a case of I'm seeing red, everybody gets it. No. People within the nation that was attacked very often were spared because they allied with Israel. Now, with time, things kind of got confused and we lost our way along the way. So things started to evolve. We come fast forward to the Renaissance and then the Enlightenment, where people were a little less easy taken in, where people were a little less naive, and the age of reason, of rationality, and science started to dawn on us.
For such a long time, the Roman Catholic Church had great power over society in a lot of matters, even including science. I mean, I take you back to my series about the Renaissance. Have a look at it if you haven't checked it out yet, where I talk about people like Galileo was placed on house arrest by the Catholic Church because what he was claiming, which is that the earth rotated around the sun and not the other way around, was considered heresy. And from Charlemagne up until quite late, the king was appointed by the Pope, therefore claiming again indirectly divinity. Now, the penultimate leg of history I'm going to talk about now is when the Roman Catholic Church and the kings of Europe started to part ways. The Reformation happened. What was the Reformation? It's basically when the king broke away from the Roman Catholics and started to do things their own way. But again, the idea of divinity or appointed by divinity survived, because now the king, starting with King Henry VIII, was the head of the church. They established their own church, the Anglican Church, and other churches after that. But that was the start of the Reformation. But gone quite away from the purest form of governments that we've come to expect. I think we can agree that whether they were appointed by God or not, what should really be the concern of king is the state of their nation. Do their nation thrive under them or not? But that idea, that concern, just doesn't seem to be a prime concern anymore. And now we're coming up to the current state of affairs with politics, in my opinion. So here we are in the 21st century, where in most countries that I've experienced, affairs of state and affairs of the church don't mix anymore. Not that much. I mean, here in the UK, every now and then you hear an archbishop or a bishop saying something about politics, but what they say don't carry as much weight as it did back in the day. But this poses a question. So now that, there's basically not that much belief in a deity, in divinity, how do politicians manage? What are their credentials now to lay a claim on government? What's their credentials nowadays? Maybe their credential is that now, in order to rule, they are required to study political science. Turns out it's not a requirement. However, if my own training as a teacher is anything to go by, training would be, at best, insufficient. A lot of theory, not enough practice. But instead, what do we see, really? It seems to me that credentials of politicians are nowadays all about perception. Are they perceived as clever? Are they perceived as charismatic? Are they perceived as competent? Rather than, do they actually have results? Do they have a track record that proves that they are able to manage resources in a benevolent, efficient way? Do they actually have moral fiber required to benefit a large group, a nation? And the thing is, I find, in my humble opinion, that these matters of perception have just taken over and has just been put on steroid to mask the reality. To my mind, the reality is this. We have stepped so much away from the purest form of governance of people, which is govern people, allocate resources, manage resources so that the whole nation thrives, and not that just the ruling elite thrives at the expense of the populace. We seem to be going in circle, because the whole point of all the revolutions after the Reformation, when kings were deposed and when democracy as we see it now emerged again in its current form, where it was vox populi vox dei. So not the voice of God anymore. The voice of God was the voice of the people. The ruling class was supposed to be a servant of the people now, not the other way around. Again, we've come back to the kingship and the divinity and all the justification of whatever I say goes. So what do we see nowadays? Media is heavily controlled. Dissent is not tolerated. Rational debate are not encouraged. Alternative voices are discouraged. See something from another point of view is now sometimes overtly forbidden. Try and say something on Google, on YouTube, and you're shadow banned. Or worse, you're cancelled. So the reality is that although I'm not advocating rebelling and not obeying the rules and making trouble just for the sake of it, however, you will not see me side with any party because to me they're all part of the ruling class. They're not in it anymore for the benefit of the whole nation, not as a majority anyway. I'm quite sure you will find a few people that are really in it for the right motives, but as a whole, the ruling class wants to sustain itself. I wrote about it. Actually, I'll put the link in the description. We have this really interesting, for lack of a better word, relationship with power. I think it's because we're not designed to handle power. We have to always have something bigger than ourselves. If we do not have something bigger than ourselves, a moral guiding principle, if not a god, we become a god ourselves. So if there's no ethical restraint to our power, a moral principle that is strong enough to keep us in line, more often than not, we abuse it. And I think that's what's happening right now. Because otherwise, why is it that at a time where we've got so many different technological advances, where we've managed to harness so much of Earth resources, we're still struggling with basic things like making a nation prosper? It's not like the resources are not there. They're very unequally distributed. The riches flow to the top. And for the populace, they're becoming poorer. The inequalities are widening rather than being reduced. Why is that? How comes with all the brain power we're not able to sort this out? Well, there's a lot of other forces at work, but I'd say one of the forces is power corrupts. I put the link about what I wrote about power and how actually there's an ancient governor called Felix, Anthonius Felix, that is kind of a metaphor for what we're experiencing now. Things have not changed. It's like King Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. The way we were is the way we are. And you just need to come to terms with that. Anyway, that's all for this series. I'm done with it. I hope I will never come back to it because this is not a subject I like. But I felt compelled. So there we are. There you have it. Reflect, redefine, rise. See you in the next one. Ciao.
Tended to claim divinity, to legitimize. Legitimize? What is that? Bloopers!
From a Christian perspective, I'd say that sometimes it was true. Like, case in point. Perspective, I would say that sometimes, oh my days, you're gonna stay
In
in
olden
the...
days, people tended to legitimize, justify their rulership. Rulership? What's a rulership? Rulership. Rulers tended to justify or
Legitimize. What is wrong with me putting S's when there's no S's? Seriously, man. Seriously. Right, okay, we're gonna get this straight. One take. Come on! Bloopers.